I never thought I'd end up standing in the doorway of an abandoned house in the middle of a storm, staring at the last woman I ever expected to see again, both of us reaching for the same rusted door handle at the exact same second. Lightning flashing behind us just long enough to show me her face before the dark swallowed it again. And in that half-second of white light I felt 11 years disappear like they had never happened at all. Her hand froze on the handle. Mine did too. Neither of us said anything for what felt like a full minute. Just the sound of rain hammering the porch roof and thunder rolling somewhere behind the tree line. And then she said my name, quiet, almost like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it out loud. I said hers back, Delphine. And just like that, the storm outside became the smaller of the two storms I was standing in. I want to tell you everything that led up to that moment, because none of it makes sense without the years underneath it. So let me take you back to earlier that day, before any of this happened, back to a campground 2 hours outside the city where I had no idea my whole life was about to fold in on itself. I'd signed up for the retreat almost as an afterthought. One of those company wellness weekends where they load 30 of us onto a bus and promise team bonding through kayaking and campfire trust exercises. And honestly, I only went because my manager practically begged me not to skip it 2 years running. I packed light, figured I'd hike a little, avoid the group activities, and be back in my apartment by Sunday night, pretending I'd learned something about leadership. What I didn't know, what nobody bothered to tell me, was that our company had partnered with another firm for this retreat to split the cost, and that firm's employee roster included a name I hadn't let myself think about in years. Delphine worked 2 departments over from where I used to work, a company I'd left not long after. Everything between us fell apart, and somewhere along the way she'd moved firms, climbed the ladder, built an entirely new life that never should have crossed paths with mine again. But retreats like this are organized by people who don't know anyone's history, who just see names on a spreadsheet and assign cabins. And so there we were, thrown into the same patch of woods without either of us having the faintest idea. I remember unpacking my tent that afternoon, laughing with a coworker about how bad the coffee was, when I caught a glimpse of a woman in a green jacket near the fire pit, hair pulled back the way Delphine used to wear it on hikes we used to take before everything went wrong. And I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, because why would she be here? Why would the universe do that to me on a random Saturday in October? I didn't get close enough to check. I told myself it didn't matter. Around midday, there was a welcome session in the main lodge, name tags, forced icebreakers, a facilitator asking us to share one thing about ourselves that surprised people, and I sat near the back, half listening, scanning the room out of some instinct I couldn't explain, and once, just once, I thought I saw the same green jacket disappear through a side door before. I could get a clear look at the face above the collar. I should tell you a little about where my life was at that point, because it matters for how strange the whole day felt. I had dated a few people since Delphine, nothing that stuck. Nothing that felt like more than filling a room that used to have someone specific in it. Friends used to tell me I compared everyone to a ghost, and I always denied it. But somewhere quiet in the back of my mind, I knew they weren't wrong. I had built a life that worked well enough on paper, a decent job, a decent apartment, weekends filled with things that looked like contentment from the outside. But there was a particular kind of silence in it that I'd stopped noticing because I'd lived with it for so long. Standing in that lodge, half convinced I'd imagined a green jacket that wasn't even hers, I remember feeling an odd mixture of hope and dread. Hope that maybe I was wrong and none of this old history was about to surface again, and dread for the exact same reason, because some stubborn part of me had never stopped wondering what I would say to her if the chance ever came. I spent the afternoon on a low-effort group hike, half listening to a speech about vulnerability and leadership, my mind somewhere else entirely, and by the time the sky started turning that strange greenish-gray that people who grew up near these mountains know means trouble, I still hadn't seen her face to face, though something in my chest had already started to brace for it. The way your body sometimes knows a storm is coming before your mind admits it. The retreat organizers started making announcements around 6, something about a storm system moving in faster than forecasted, telling everyone to secure their tents and stay close to the main lodge. But nobody really listened the way they should have, because it's hard to take a weather warning seriously when you're holding a marshmallow on a stick and half the group is already 3 beers in, laughing too loud, feeding the fire like it was any other Saturday night. I was refilling my water bottle near the supply tent when the wind changed, not gradually, but all at once. Like someone had opened a door somewhere far away and let the whole sky in. And within minutes the rain wasn't falling anymore, it was being thrown sideways. And the first tent went down not far from where I stood, poles snapping like dry branches, and someone screamed for everyone to get to the lodge. That's when chaos does what chaos does. It strips away every plan you had, every seating chart and schedule, and turns 30 coworkers into 30 individuals running in whatever direction feels safest in the moment. Flashlights swung wildly through the trees. Someone's cooler tipped over and rolled past me. A tarp tore loose from its posts and sailed sideways like a wounded bird. And somewhere near the fire pit I heard a woman's voice cry out, sharp and startled, cut off almost immediately by a crack of thunder, so loud it seemed to come from directly overhead. And for one unsettled second, I wondered if it had been her voice. If she was out there somewhere in the same chaos I was standing in. Before the thought got lost in the noise and I had no time left to chase it, in the middle of all that noise, I grabbed my bag, started toward the tree line because it was closer than the lodge, and within seconds I'd lost sight of everyone I came with. Swallowed by rain and dark, and the kind of wind that makes you put your arm up just to see where you're going, I want to be honest with you about what that felt like. Because it wasn't just fear of the storm, it was this strange, disorienting sense that the ground I thought I understood, the plans I thought I had for the weekend, had all been ripped away in about 90 seconds. And I was just a person running through trees with no idea what direction led back to safety. Branches whipped at my arms. My boots kept catching on roots hidden under wet leaves. And twice I nearly went down completely, catching myself against tree trunks slick with rain, my breath ragged, my heart pounding from equal parts exertion and something closer to panic. At one point I heard voices calling out somewhere off to my left. Other people from the retreat scattering in their own directions, someone shouting a name that wasn't mine, and for a moment I almost turned toward them, thinking safety in numbers might be smarter than whatever instinct was pulling me deeper into the trees. But the wind shifted again, carrying rain in a solid sheet that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the voices faded behind me as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving me alone with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the storm doing its best to swallow even that. I don't know how long I ran. Time does something strange to you in moments like that, stretching and folding at once, so it could have been 5 minutes or 20. But at some point the trees started to thin, and I saw it, a shape against the storm that didn't belong to the forest, a house, old and dark, windows like empty sockets, but a roof, walls, something solid in a world that had turned entirely liquid and loud. I ran for it without thinking twice, adrenaline carrying me the last stretch across a clearing that had turned to mud. And that's when I saw her, another shape moving toward the same porch from the opposite direction. And for one confused second I thought it was just another stranger from the retreat, seeking the same shelter I was. Until the lightning cracked overhead and lit up her face for that half second I already told you about, and my whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through my jacket. We got the door open together, some shared instinct making us both throw our weight against it at once. And it gave way into a musty front room that smelled like old wood and dust, and something faintly like wood smoke from a fire that hadn't burned in years. Neither of us moved for a moment once we were inside. The door swung shut behind us on its own, pushed by the wind, and suddenly the storm was a muffled roar instead of a physical thing trying to knock us down. And it was just the two of us standing in the dark, breathing hard, staring at each other like neither one of us trusted what we were seeing. She said my name again. This time not a question, just an acknowledgement. Like she was testing whether saying it out loud would make the moment more real or less real. I told her I couldn't believe it, and she said the same thing back. And for a second, we just stood there laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was crying. And neither of us wanted to do that in front of the other. Not yet. Not this soon. Not before we'd even had a chance to catch our breath. I found a dusty oil lamp on a shelf near an old stone fireplace. The kind of house that probably belonged to whoever built these trails decades ago and never came back to. Shelves still lined with cracked dishes, a calendar on the wall frozen on a month from years before either of us was born. And by some miracle there was still oil in the lamp, thick and old, but enough. And I lit it with the lighter I keep in my bag for exactly this kind of emergency. Though I never imagined this particular emergency. The light it threw was small and orange and shaking slightly, but it was enough to see her by, really see her. Older than the last time, a few new lines near her eyes, hair a little shorter, but unmistakably the same person who used to fall asleep on my shoulder. During long drives and argue with me about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, we found dry blankets folded in an old cedar chest against the wall, mildewed at the edges but usable, and we wrapped ourselves in them and sat, eventually, on an old wooden bench someone had left behind, close enough to share warmth but far enough that neither of us had to acknowledge how strange that closeness felt. The house creaked around us with every gust that hit it, old boards settling and groaning in a way that would have unsettled me under any other circumstances. But that night it just felt like background noise to something much louder happening between the two of us. A conversation neither of us had signed up for, but neither of us was willing to walk away from either. She asked what I was doing here, at this retreat, in this town, and I told her the truth, that I had no idea her company had merged operations with a firm connected to mine, that if I'd known she would be there I might have made up an excuse to stay home. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I wasn't sure I could survive it. She laughed at that, a real laugh, tired but real, and said she felt exactly the same. That she'd almost canceled twice that week for reasons she couldn't fully explain to her coworkers, blaming it on a headache the first time and a family thing the second, when really it had just been a feeling she couldn't shake. Outside, the storm kept working itself into a frenzy. Rain slamming the windows, wind finding every gap in the old wood and turning it into a low moan. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled long enough that we both went quiet and waited for it to pass before continuing. The lamp flame leaning sideways in a draft neither of us could locate. We talked about small things first, safe things. Her new apartment near the river, my new job, and the manager who never stopped talking about Synergy. A mutual friend who'd gotten married the year before and invited neither of us because by then we weren't a unit anymore. Just a people who used to be one and now moved through the world separately. Orbiting old friends without ever colliding, until tonight. She told me about a relationship that had lasted almost 3 years after we split. A man named Owen who she said was kind and steady and entirely wrong for her in ways she couldn't articulate until it ended. And I told her about my own attempts. A woman I'd dated for over a year who once asked me point blank why. I flinched every time she mentioned wanting to meet my family, a question I never had a good answer for. We laughed about how bad we'd both apparently become at letting people in, comparing notes like two people examining the same old injury from different angles, and for a moment it felt almost comfortable, almost like no time had passed at all. The two of us falling into the easy rhythm of conversation we used to have before everything got complicated, but you can only talk about safe things for so long when you're sitting 3 feet from someone whose absence has quietly shaped every relationship you've had since. And eventually the conversation turned. The way water finds the lowest point in a landscape whether you want it to or not. She asked me finally the question I always knew she would ask if we ever ended up in a room together again. Why I stopped calling? Why I went cold that spring? Why I let her be the one to end it when she always felt like I had already left, long before she said the words out loud. Her voice cracked slightly on the last part, and she looked away toward the fireplace like she needed somewhere else to put her eyes, while she waited for my answer. And I remember thinking that whatever I said next was going to matter more than almost anything I'd ever said to another person. More than any presentation, any apology, any conversation I'd rehearsed 100 times in the shower, and never actually delivered. I asked for a minute before I answered. I remember staring at the lamp flame, watching it flicker, trying to figure out how to say 11 years of silence out loud in a way that wouldn't sound like an excuse. Because I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head more times than I could count, and never once found words that felt honest enough. I want you to understand something about the years leading up to that moment in the house, because it matters for what happened next. When Delphine and I were together, her father had gotten sick, not suddenly, but the slow, grinding kind of sick that turns a family's whole rhythm upside down. Doctor's appointments, eating weekends, medication schedules, replacing dinner plans, the particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone whose body is quietly betraying them 1 week at a time. I used to sit with her in hospital waiting rooms doing nothing but existing next to her, holding coffee she wouldn't drink, because that was the only thing I could offer that felt like it mattered. The only currency I had. Her father and I had always gotten along, or so I thought, cracking jokes about baseball, arguing gently about politics, until one afternoon he asked me to come sit with him alone while Delphine was getting coffee down the hall. And what he said to me that day I never repeated to another living soul until the night I'm telling you about now. He told me he was dying faster than the doctors were letting on, that he could feel it in ways numbers on a chart couldn't capture, some quiet certainty settling into his bones, and that his biggest fear wasn't his own death. It was what would happen to his daughter afterward. He said Delphine had spent her whole life taking care of other people, that she'd do the same thing with me if I let her, that she'd bury her own future trying to hold both of us together, him in his illness and me in whatever mess young men my age tend to carry, and that watching her split herself in 2 directions was the one thing he couldn't bear to witness in whatever time he had left. He asked me to leave her, not out of cruelty, but out of some desperate, fumbling attempt at protection, so she would grieve one loss cleanly instead of drowning in 2 at once. So she'd have the emotional space to fall apart over him without also worrying about holding a relationship together on top of it. I told him he was wrong, that I could handle both, that I loved her too much to walk away over a request made in fear. And he said something I've never forgotten, that love isn't proven by staying. Sometimes it's proven by knowing when your presence is a burden disguised as a comfort. I didn't believe him, not at first. I left that hospital room angry, certain I could prove him wrong just by loving her harder, by showing up more, by being the exception to whatever fear was driving him. But over the following weeks I started noticing things. How tired she looked, not just from her father's illness, but from constantly checking on me too, asking if I was okay, if we were okay, absorbing my moods on top of her own grief, until there was nothing left in her for herself. And I began to understand, slowly and painfully, that maybe he wasn't entirely wrong, that maybe the kindest thing I could give her wasn't more of me, but less. So I made the worst decision of my life for what I still believe were the right reasons. I started pulling away, not all at once, because that would have looked too intentional, but slowly, missed calls, shorter conversations, canceled plans blamed on work, distance dressed up as busyness, until she was the one who eventually looked at me across a kitchen table and asked if I even wanted this anymore. And instead of telling her the truth, Instead of explaining what her father had asked of me in that hospital room, I said no. 2 letters. The easiest lie I ever told, and the one that cost me the most. I let her think I'd simply stopped loving her. I let her carry that belief for 11 years because I thought it was kinder than the alternative. Kinder than telling her that her dying father had asked me to disappear so she could grieve, without the weight of a relationship on top of it. Kinder than making her carry both truths at once when one was already more than enough. Sitting in that house, lantern flickering between us, rain hammering the windows, I told her all of it, every piece. Watching her face change from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked almost like anger. Not at me exactly, but at the years she'd spent believing a story that was never true. He asked you to do that, she repeated, like she needed to hear the words again just to believe I'd actually said them. He asked you to leave me, and you just did it. You never once thought to tell me, to let me decide for myself. I told her I understood if she was angry, that I'd asked myself the same question more nights than I could count. Whether I'd taken something away from her that should never have been mine to take, the choice itself. The chance to decide what she could or couldn't handle. She asked if her father knew I'd actually gone through with it, and I told her he did, that he thanked me once, briefly, quietly, a few months before he passed, gripping my hand in a hallway when Delphine had stepped away, though we never spoke of it again after that single moment. Why didn't you just tell me the truth after he died? She asked, and it was a fair question. One I'd turned over in my mind for years, without ever landing on an answer that satisfied me. I told her that by the time enough time had passed that it might have made sense to reach out. We were both already living entirely separate lives, and I had convinced myself that reopening the wound would only hurt her twice. Once for the loss of her father, and once for the truth about how her relationship really ended. And that silence, however unfair, felt like the smaller cruelty at the time. She went very still when I mentioned that he was gone, and I realized in that moment she hadn't fully processed until right then that I already knew. That I'd been carrying the knowledge of her father's death and the reason behind our breakup as one single secret for over a decade, while she carried an entirely different, entirely false story about a man who simply stopped caring somewhere along the way. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Neither did I. We just sat there while the storm outside seemed to hold its breath along with us. And then, without warning, lightning struck something close. A tree maybe, or the old barn we'd passed on our way in. Close enough that the entire house shook and the lamp flickered violently, and for a second, I thought the flame might die completely, plunging us into total dark. She grabbed my arm on instinct, the way anyone would when the world seems to physically lurch beneath them, and I put my hand over hers without thinking. And we stayed like that, gripping each other in the near dark, waiting to see if the light would survive whatever had just happened outside. For a few seconds, neither of us breathed, listening for the sound of a falling branch, or worse, some confirmation that whatever had been struck wasn't about to come crashing through the roof above us. And when nothing followed but the steady drum of rain, I felt her exhale slowly against my shoulder, a long, shaky breath that seemed to carry more than just relief from the lightning. It did, barely, the flame steadying itself into a small, determined glow, and somehow that felt symbolic in a way neither of us needed to say out loud. She didn't let go of my arm right away. I didn't ask her to. We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the storm slowly start to lose its edge. The wind softening from a scream to a low complaint, the rain easing from a hammering to something almost gentle against the old roof. And somewhere in that quiet I felt something shift between us. Some old current finding its channel again after 11 years of being dammed up. At some point she asked me if I regretted it, walking away like that, and I told her the truth, that I regretted the way I did it more than the fact that I did it at all. That if I could go back, I would have told her everything, instead of letting her invent a version of me that didn't love her, because that version haunted me more than any real conversation could have, more than any argument we might have had if I'd simply told her what her father asked of me, and let her decide for herself what to do with it. She was quiet for a long time after that, and then she said something I wasn't ready for. That for years she'd told herself she was over it. That she'd built an entire life designed around never needing anyone the way she needed me back then. Dating carefully, keeping people at arm's length, telling herself it was independence when really it was armor. And that sitting across from me in that house, hearing the truth for the first time, made her realize she'd spent over a decade grieving the wrong thing entirely. Not the loss of me, but the loss of a version of events that had never actually happened. I used to drive past your old building sometimes, she admitted quietly, staring at the lamp instead of at me, just to see if your car was there. And then I'd feel so stupid for doing it that I'd tell myself I was over you, and go home and believe it for a few more months until I did it again. I told her I understood that feeling better than she probably realized. That I'd kept a folder of old photos on my phone I never had the courage to delete. That some part of me had been waiting, quietly and without much hope, for exactly the kind of accident that had just thrown us into the same storm on the same night. We didn't sleep much that night. We talked until the lamp burned low, and the storm finally exhausted itself somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, trading stories we'd never told anyone else, filling in the gaps of 11 separate years in a matter of hours, laughing more than either of us expected to laugh, crying a little too. the kind of crying that feels more like relief than grief. She told me about the years she spent building her career like it was armored too, taking every promotion offered just to keep herself too busy to think. And I told her about the nights I'd sit in my apartment replaying the last real conversation we ever had, trying to find the exact sentence where things had gone wrong, never once landing on the true answer because the true answer was sitting 3 feet away from me now, finally being spoken out loud after 11 years of silence, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, when the wind had gone completely silent, and only the drip of water from the eaves marked the passage of time, she fell asleep with her head against my shoulder the exact same way she used to on those long drives, and I stayed awake, watching the gray light slowly bleed in through the dirty windows, thinking about how strange it is that a storm that destroyed an entire campsite had somehow rebuilt something in me I thought was gone for good. When morning finally came, pale and washed out, the world outside looked like it had been through a war, branches everywhere, the trail half flooded, leaves plastered against every surface like the forest itself had been rearranged overnight. But the sky was clear in that fragile apologetic way skies get after a bad night. Thin sunlight breaking through clouds that still hadn't decided whether to fully clear. We walked back to the campground together, not talking much, just close, her hand finding mine somewhere along the trail without either of us commenting on it. And when we got there we found rescue crews already sweeping the area, checking names off a list. Relief spreading across worried faces as coworkers who'd been separated all night found each other again in small, tearful reunions near the lodge steps. Someone from my company saw me first and called out that I was safe, and within minutes, people were hugging, laughing with the particular exhaustion of people who'd survived something together, comparing stories of where they'd sheltered, who they'd been with, a few of them describing close calls with falling branches or flooded ravines that made our night in the old house sound almost peaceful by comparison. A woman I barely recognized from the other firm hugged Delphine tightly, telling her everyone had been terrified when she didn't show up at the first head count, and Delphine just nodded along, glancing at me over the woman's shoulder like we were sharing a secret neither of us was ready to explain to anyone else yet. In the middle of all of it, Delphine and I stood a little apart from the crowd, looking at each other like two people who'd just been handed a second chance. Neither of us had asked for, but both of us desperately needed. She asked me, quietly enough that no one else could hear, whether I meant it when I said I regretted how things ended, and I told her I meant every word, that if she was willing, I didn't want to spend the drive home pretending this was just a strange story we'd tell people at parties, something that happened to us instead of something that changed us. She smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her since the lightning first split the sky the night before, and she said maybe the storm did us a favor neither of us would have asked for on our own, forcing us into a room together long enough to finally say the things we should have said over a decade ago. We exchanged numbers again, standing in the wet grass, feeling almost foolish about it given everything we'd just been through, and before the buses arrived to take everyone home, she asked if I'd call her that week, not out of politeness, but because she actually wanted to know, and I told her I would. And for the first time in 11 years, I meant it completely, without a hidden reason, without a secret waiting to unravel it. On the bus ride home, watching the storm-battered trees blur past the window, I found myself thinking about her father, about that hospital room, and the fear in his voice. And for the first time since he'd asked me to disappear, I didn't feel guilty about the promise I'd kept. I felt grateful, in a strange, complicated way, that a storm none of us saw coming had finally given both of us the conversation his fear had taken away over a decade before. I called her 3 days later, the way I said I would, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important. The kind of conversation that matters more for the fact that it happens than for anything said inside it. We've been talking every day since, slowly, carefully, like two people rebuilding a bridge. They know how to build but have forgotten exactly where all the old supports used to be. I won't pretend it's simple, picking up 11 years later, learning who someone has become, instead of assuming they're still who they were. But there's something steadying about doing it with someone who already knows your worst secret and chose to stay in the room anyway. We drove out to see that old house again a few weeks later, just to prove to ourselves it hadn't been some strange storm-induced dream, and it was smaller in daylight than either of us remembered, quieter, the kind of place that looks almost unremarkable when it isn't holding an entire storm and 11 years of silence inside it. Delphine stood on the porch for a long time that afternoon, running her hand along the same door frame we'd both grabbed at once, and she told me she was grateful, in a strange way, that the storm hadn't given us any warning at all, because warning would have given either of us the chance to avoid what we needed most. Standing there beside her in the quiet daylight, no thunder, no lantern, just two people, and an old house that had somehow held space for everything we needed to say, I understood that some conversations only happen when the world leaves you nowhere else to go. If you've ever loved someone and let them believe the wrong reason for losing you, you'll understand exactly why I spent 11 years carrying a secret heavier than any storm, and why, when the sky finally cleared that morning, it felt less like the end of something and more like the very beginning we never got to have the first time.